Hello, everyone, and welcome to A Mind of Her Own. My guest today is Dr. Russell Ramsay. He's a psychologist specializing in the assessment and psychosocial treatment of adult ADHD. He has lectured internationally, published widely on this topic, and is a Hall of Fame inductee into the Children and Adults with Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder organization. He's the author of 6 books on adult ADHD, many of which I have read and used in my patient care, including his most recent titled Once I Get Started, the Adult ADHD Program for Turning Your Intentions into Actions, which was just released on May 19th. So, Dr. Ramsay, congratulations on this wonderful new book and welcome to the podcast.
Dr. Reed, my former Penn colleague, thanks for having me.
I wanted to start with, which I thought was really effective in the book, I think for listeners, just a series of quotes that you sort of put in for what people might express. Adults coming in, now that we know that it doesn't just go away once we hit 18, that many adults may be struggling with this or carry a diagnosis. So one of the quotes, it was, "I'm busy all day, but I don't get anything done. I want something to show for my efforts. You have
Right.
everyone in my life is tired of my lateness and unreliability." And the last one I'd say is, "I can't get motivated unless I'm facing the deadline and what I produce isn't as good as it could be." So I think these really highlight sort of a shift that you describe in the book for how we think about ADHD. I mean, it's just within the name that we're so focused on attention and hyperactivity, but actually we might be looking at it a little bit. That might be a piece of it, but we might be really missing a big chunk. And you describe it as sort of a performance problem, not a knowledge problem. So tell us a little bit about what you think we're sort of missing in the ADHD title and focus on those areas specifically.
Right. And I'll stand on the shoulders of a colleague, and I consider him a professional friend. What Dr. Russ Barkley would say, calling ADHD an attention problem is like calling autism eye gaze disorder. It
Mm,
captures an element of it, but not the essence. So we're really understanding ADHD as a problem of self-regulation. How efficiently do you do what you set out to do? Not the pursuit necessarily of a master's degree or some criteria like you have to have a 6-digit salary, just the things that for your sense of self you want to try or do. And these can be some of the have tos of life, but also many of the want tos and the difficulties organizing behavior across time to at least see them through and find out whether they work for us or not. So that consistent inconsistency I refer to, and that has ripple effects because the attention deficit sounds very quaint. Oh, that's you're scattered, you're, maybe looking all over the place. It can really get in the way of work and school is usually where it shows up first because there are some performance expectations there, but also relationships, parenting, pet ownership, and increasingly looking at health outcomes, including risk for early mortality, because keeping up with reasonable health behaviors, trying to reduce unhealthy health behaviors, and just a host of other things that I hate to be a downer to start with it because there's a lot of people who can achieve great things, but also sometimes there's that twice as hard for half as much. For professionals with ADHD. And, I know a topic near and dear to your heart, often many women with ADHD who, just from recent CDC data, were discovering they had been underrepresented and usually get diagnosed much later in life.
yeah. And you've written about it that we should call ADHD executive dysfunction disorder. And I'm wondering what are some of these key executive functions that we all need to have and how ADHD can affect them in people.
Right. And that again, standing on Russ Barkley's shoulders, but there's only so many ways only so many letters you can put together. The core executive functions that unfold developmentally in order. One is there's a sense of self, that we're a distinct entity. And I'm reading works by Antonio Damasio, who talks about the neurological underpinnings of self and consciousness. But after that, sorry, you got the geek out here.
I love it.
Inhibition, to be able to stop automatically responding to the environment, stimulus response, and pause. And in the pause, now we can act with intention. We can consider what got us here, where we want to go, and what steps do I take. That's going to look different for like a 3-year-old than a 33-year-old. But then there's nonverbal working memory, which is the ability to imagine to ourselves, run visual simulations in our head about different scenarios. Like, what order do I want to run my errands in today? Let me run through the sequence and timing that. Verbal working memory, which is our self-talk, how we internalization of language, and it's our cognitions, but also how we, in effect, talk ourselves through situations and stay on track and be a voice of reason often or not. Um, Emotional regulation and motivation, being able to um, shift emotional states, and that could be down regulating often unpleasant or negative emotions, or up regulation, which is motivation, the ability to generate an emotion about a task in the absence of an immediate consequence. Then there's reconstitution, which comes from the childhood capacity to play, taking things apart, putting them together in novel ways, maybe. Role plays, playing like a superhero or whatever. So those are the basic underpinnings, and then how that manifests. And I think this is why the self-regulation or executive function, which are the self-regulation capacities that everybody has. So we all have executive functions. It's just that ADHD, it's at the, for lack of a better phrase, a clumsy term, but the disordered end of the bell-shaped curve. This is the time management, the organizing behavior across time, the time blindness, being too nearsighted, having a harder time with delayed gains, organization and problem solving, using resources at our disposal to handle real world problems, the emotional regulation, the impulse control, and the impulsivity. The attention issues and time management issues with ADHD are most persistent, but we underestimate grown-up impulsivity. Impulsivity is a core feature of procrastination. I know I should be doing this, but let me just do this for a minute. The emotional impulsivity, impulsive spending, impulsive statements, um, and there's also that's the motivation side, but it's also the emotional regulation piece. So, and that's important because emotions don't show up anywhere in the DSM or ICD criteria for ADHD, but we now know that they're a core feature of it. So that's the overview of both the underpinnings for the executive function, self-regulation, and what we're looking for. And it's often the language of the problems that bring people to us. They're usually not saying, Dr. Ramsay, I want to pay attention, and I'm going, okay, look at my nose for 15 seconds. Let's see if we can get up to 25 by the end of the session. It's usually, I'm always late, I'm busy all day. I can't control my feelings. I get overwhelmed. One client said, I'm underwhelmed. I just want to be whelmed. And so there's a whole host of things that can get in the way of things, including putting our best self forward and being able to follow through in the things that we want to do.
Yeah. And you mentioned before that women have been underdiagnosed. I think girls may manifest symptoms that aren't quite as disruptive sometimes as young boys do, but I think there are a number of different reasons for this lower diagnosis. But what I think is so interesting and that you do highlight in the book is this idea of self-mistrust that can develop over time. This sort of sense of, I know I want to do this, but I never follow through. I'm not going to be able to do this. And I think that is where there's a lot of overlap with my writing on guilt in women, is this sense that I'm not meeting these expectations and I'm repeatedly not meeting them. And it must be something I'm doing wrong, right? This sense that they come in sort of demoralized saying, it's always been the case. I'm just someone who I don't follow through or I can't get things done. And so I think that it seems like that piece is so important. I was so glad you highlighted that mistrust. And how do you see that manifest maybe in the women that you work with?
Yeah, and very often, and even I was like reading a book on ADHD recently, keeping up with what everybody else is doing, and just some of the examples that I circled a couple times. Okay, they quoted somebody as saying, "I just don't trust myself to do it," and it's I heard, over the years, it was in the first book, I had mentioned something about self-mistrust because in cognitive therapy, there are schema, and one of the schema is mistrust. Now, generally, it was other mistrust. Somebody was abused or in bad relationships, so they wouldn't trust relationships. And it just struck me, and it was just more of like a clinical overview, but it was like, yeah, my folks with ADHD are describing, I can't trust myself. And that relationship that we have with ourself, which that relationship is also part of self-compassion, but then the self-mistrust is sort of the opposite because, as you rightly said, I can't trust myself. I'm lying to myself. I can't trust myself to do what I set out to do when facing the consequences and critiques. And also, maybe letting others down and getting feedback about that, not following through on promises with a spouse. Another one of the quotes I got from a client was from a husband about his wife. He said, I have ADHD, my wife suffers from it. Um, but, so that self-mistrust, I had a book-long argument saying that this um, seems to me like a pretty solid theme related to the executive functions. There's other thoughts and feelings that can come with it. And there's actually I ran across some studies that would support this hypothesis, but not with ADHD, but with non-clinical controls, but with procrastination and, things like that. But, going back to how it manifests, and especially with women, and probably why women get diagnosed later, even though it's getting better. Um, Generally, um, more identified with many roles, and many of these are cultural, and males have a bunch of identified roles too. But um, both with the difficulties fulfilling those roles, and also, as you said, how symptoms can be missed. But even with children, even when there's agreement upon maybe some of the more hyperactive impulsive symptoms, that they're there, but they don't get attributed to ADHD for girls as much as they do for boys. And one of the throw off quotes that is helpful, but I wouldn't, I challenge all or nothing thinking, but boys ADHD shows up in the classroom, but girls shows up on the playground. So it may be like even, and this is true for other kids with ADHD and adults in a way too, violating social norms, not following the rule of the game, not being present. It might be being distracted. It might be just be doing too big of a personality, and that, people withdraw from. So there's a lot of different manifestations over time. And then later on, women are more likely to be diagnosed first with depression or anxiety and maybe partially treated for that. And it's not wrong. But what's undergirding either the intolerance of uncertainty with the anxiety or the dysphoric mood is the recurring frustrations and difficulties, and that get magnified, that magnify and are magnified by the self-mistrust thoughts. And it's not necessarily confidence, because people will say, I know I can do it, I've done it before, but that uncertainty, which, the intolerance of uncertainty is also considered a core feature of anxiety, and which is probably why it's the number one coexisting diagnosis with ADHD, a hair ahead of depression. But that uncertainty, and then the difficulties with the follow through, that leads to that self-mistrust. And it also, because so much of the executive functions are about our self-expression and what we want to do, well, then we're going to be harder on ourselves when we're not doing it. And, including and especially women with ADHD, especially without the explanatory model of this makes sense in terms of ADHD. It must be like one of the first popular books on ADHD back in the mid 90s, a title I still cite all the time. You mean I'm not lazy, stupid, or crazy? Because that's usually the self-attributions that anybody with ADHD has before they have an understanding of it.
And I think women may come in and say, I think a through line that you have in the book, which I think is also really important to highlight, is this idea that you can be high functioning in a number of areas, and even that symptoms can be intermittent. So certain contexts, certain times in your life, that having like true consistency across all these different contexts is maybe not the norm. but it does make it more difficult, I think, to diagnose. But maybe women come in and say, trying to carry all these roles as a mother and working and caring for elderly parents, like the cognitive load that comes with that might
Yes.
be sort of the first time that they're starting to experience the significance of these symptoms, things falling through the cracks. And then you have the overlap of perimenopause, where there can be some cognitive changes, right? So
Yes.
one of our colleagues, Dr. Shenmugen, has studied stimulants for some of those cognitive challenges. So I think it's a difficult picture. And here we are trying to find symptoms from prior to age 12. Like, I'm wondering how you kind of start with someone who comes in and has been very high functioning, but is clearly struggling now.
Usually it's got to come from somewhere. So if somebody is spending it all at work, then usually there's some ripple effects at home as a partner, as a parent, or vice versa. If there's, and there can be a primary role or, just hopefully a shared role, but still it takes up a lot of energy. Parenting is hard work if you're not familiar with it. Um, but then maybe there's difficulties at work, or it can come from somewhere else, personal well-being, sacrificing sleep. So that's why part of an evaluation is going back, and even if was never diagnosed with ADHD, which isn't a requirement for adult ADHD having the previous diagnosis, but just that many symptoms emerge, and asking about not just what were your grades before I started, got drawn into the ADHD world by Tony. Um, my educational evaluation in the intake interviews I was doing at the Center for Cognitive Therapy was, how far did you get in school? What were your grades like? Any difficulties? Let's move on. Now, even if somebody was valedictorian of the school, I want to ask how they got there.
Yeah.
And I hear the stories about, even at a young age, sacrificing sleep, pulling all-nighters, cheating, or parents sitting, and this would be loving parents sitting with them to make sure they got the homework done. Or sometimes they were tired and had to get to work the next day, maybe finishing the science project or whatever. Um, and it's how it was masked or covered up for a while until those supports are removed, often in college, but maybe later because people will do enough to get by, not fulfilling potential, but still C's get degrees. But then usually there's some point where the coping is unsustainable, or the all of a sudden what worked in school doesn't work at the workplace and it's just too much, and that's what brings them in, or somebody else is concerned. But usually when you look back, and I do 12 years old in my evaluation, but there's strong evidence to say 16 would be a better age for the onset,
Right.
because those middle school years, where at least in Western societies, we're expecting a little bit more of taking the reins, if you will. But that's usually where it shows up, where there's more. You have your own locker. You bring your book bag home. I'm Gen
Mm-hmm.
Xer, so I'm old school a little bit, or at least remember to download the textbook or whatever the case may be, or checking on the online grading system or the assignments, which is really easy not to do. And so there's all these ways it can be hidden that are accounted for in an evaluation. But again, many women, like going back to the CDC data, U.S. data from 2024, that found 50% of individuals with ADHD were diagnosed at 18 years old or older, and 61% of those were women. That there were more women, fewer women diagnosed within before age 12. So that more late identified. And again, we're getting better, but it is looking underneath the anxiety. It's looking at the performing of roles, which anxiety and depression can get in the way of. But it's usually the stuff that the person says, I know what to do, or the running late. It's not usually the content of the job. It's the showing up on time. It's the performance improvement plans late, often, but usually not for not being good at their profession. It's the things around, like the billable hours for attorneys. Um, Something near and dear to our heart. The documentation. We got the Excel sheets where the yellow bars of shame.
Yes.
If our Epic notes weren't up to date, which is useful to have that cue, but even there, people can fall behind because, oh, I have to parent my children, take care of other things. So there's a lot of different ways it can get through the gaps, including other people looking at you from the outside and saying, you seem so together, but somebody saying you don't see the cost that
Mm-hmm.
it is requiring.
one line I came across in there was validating for me as a clinician because I do find making a diagnosis in this area for adults is really hard. And the line was there are currently no formal US guidelines for diagnosing adult ADHD, which was validating. I mean, we know we have the DSM criteria, but as far as like how do you really get a sense if you're seeing someone in their 30s, 40s, 50s of their childhood, you don't have a parent to talk to, like
Right,
what should these guidelines be and how could we kind of simplify it to
right.
really help people understand?
Well, I'll tell you what, in the book on the chapter on the diagnosis, there's an article by one of my favorite people, Dr. Margaret Sibley. And you've probably heard her name. She gets quoted all the time. She's involved in a lot of research. She's a leader in the field. She had a book about, here are the guidelines. Here's the recommendations for a first-time adult ADHD diagnosis. And I don't think I'm talking out of school. Maggie's also, um, the current U.S. guidelines are underway with through the American Professional Society of ADHD and Related Disorders. They just always take longer than you think. But I think she's heading up the evaluation process. So I think I even write in the book that my guess is Maggie's outline will be probably pretty close to it. Um, so at its core, and I do supersize this, a clinical interview is sufficient and gathering, and it can be useful to use self-report and other report questionnaires for symptoms and functioning if you want. So where the individual under the evaluation who is suspected of possibly having ADHD completes them, but also, and DSM mentions this, having somebody who knows them also give their observer ratings. Um, but also, it's going to be most likely there's data to say that still follow up the interview, ask about these things, both childhood and adulthood, is going to be the preferred way to gather the symptoms, even though the questionnaires can help. Also, doing a thorough evaluation for everything else that could be causing the quote unquote attention problem, because you also want to follow the guidelines of verifying that symptoms emerged in childhood, persisted into adulthood, and are making a direct and causal contribution to problems. And if you can do that and either determine ADHD stands alone or these other factors coexist with it, that would be sufficient. Now, I would add to that some sort of executive functioning questionnaire. And going back on research on executive functions, the self-report is more reliable than executive, quote unquote, executive functioning tests, office-based tests, because the, the executive functions are there to help us adapt to different environments and relationships. And so the executive functioning tests, they're usually messy because they get conflated with intelligence and other skills. So the self-reports and observer reports can be really helpful in that. Now, that is, I always say, at least for now, they're not required to make the diagnosis to open up somebody to treatment. And I always say the DSM symptoms aren't bad, but they're just incomplete. That the executive functions, and there's some research on DSM-4 and DSM-5, executive functions emerged as a reliable diagnostic factor. So it's always good if they get added in. There could be other testing for learning differences or things like that, but they're not required uh, to establish the diagnosis.
I remember I had a colleague previously who was just adamant that a clinical assessment was inadequate to diagnose ADHD and one had to do like neuropsychological testing or cognitive testing. And I'm wondering what your viewpoint is around referring for testing, what's out there, both helpful if at all and certainly unhelpful or expensive.
Right, right. You know what? I think some of the most helpful, and some of these we did at Penn while I was there. And yeah, and I certainly respect them. I'm just going back to like, what's the bare minimum? But with these, it's usually some sort of continuous performance task, which is generally a computerized version. I mean, it's going to be more elegant than what I'm about to say, but usually some version of like Simon Says. Do whatever the leader says, but only if they say Simon says. So touch your nose, touch your forehead. Oh, I'm sorry. Simon says touch your nose. Simon says, see, I already failed. Simon says touch your nose. Simon says touch your forehead. Clap your hands, didn't say Simon Says. It's that it was competing, and that's what working memory is, being able to hold on to different responsibilities. I have to do this, but then I have to do that. I have to pace myself. So there are some very, I get no money from them, but the QB test is very well regarded, and that's what we used at Penn at the time I left. It's probably still there. And there are other various other ones so now in terms of overall neuropsychological testing, I don't think it's ever a bad way, bad idea to get, sort of a snapshot of how your brain is doing and strengths and weaknesses. But in terms of making and there are some tests that have some moderate reliability with the diagnosis, but um, they're not required. So I'm certainly respectful of colleagues who do that, but one, like I said, some of the tests can be messy. And the other thing is sometimes with a novel situation, somebody can hold it together for a 20, 30-minute test in an office as opposed to an 8-hour workday or a 7-day week where we're organizing behavior over longer stretches of time. And there's lots of debates about this. So again, I want to be respectful of the whole gamut of things. But if we're looking at trying to be most parsimonious here with what we do, I'm just trying to put some bounds on it.
I appreciate that because I think just it becomes a barrier. It's expensive, it's hard to find, it's time consuming. You have to really organize enough to get there. And I think we're already with someone who's struggling with time management and organization and then asking, kind of putting up barriers. So I've always found it a really difficult sell and had different approaches on that. But I agree. I think really doing a thorough clinical assessment seems to be most effective.
Right.
So when someone's coming in, I think there is an expectation that I'm coming in, I'm getting a diagnosis, I start a stimulant. Like that's sort of the treatment, that's what's available. It's the only thing that's available. And obviously, your amazing work and many others are highlighting CBT that's adapted for ADHD. And then there's a quote in the book that says, the skills are not the pills. So I know that, I mean, our stimulants are some of our more effective treatments in our field.
Yes.
But they're not everything. Not everyone can tolerate them. Not everyone wants them. Not everyone, maybe they have contraindications for any number of health reasons. So let's start by talking about CBT. Like, how would you pitch it to someone who's like, no, I just want to start a med. That's all I want. How could this be helpful?
How it was presented to me several times, this is my answer. It's like, I know exactly what I need to do. There are medications. What good is talking with you about this going to do me? And my answer has been, you know what? I'm pretty good at helping people and colleagues as well, but I'll do it first person at helping people understand how they don't do things. Not just work harder to be on time, work harder to be organized, but reverse engineering. How do you procrastinate? How are you not on time? And then if we turn these into specific, smaller actions, things that won't be shocking, but part of that executive functioning with time management and organization is event segmentation and sequencing. And it's pretty much what our grandmothers would tell us, break a large task down into small steps. And that's what working memory does. But with ADHD, it needs to be it benefits from being more explicit. So sort of a first this, then that, at least to, hence the title of the book, to get started, where once somebody gets started, they might be more likely to go on, as opposed to just doing it in our head and even in conversation or sketching it out. And that's part of the pause. And it's sort of like slowing down the executive function. So that's one of the major adaptations of the cognitive behavioral therapy for ADHD is that explicit inclusion of the executive functioning as the main coping mechanisms and following through on what we know works and personalizing it to individuals and circumstances. Now, with that, the classic CBT, negative thinking doesn't cause ADHD, but it usually comes up around it because things that I've done and I should be able to do again and more consistently, I don't do the self-mistrust. The emotional regulation piece, I say the main target there is dealing with the discomfort. These are things you won't feel. Nobody in their right mind feels like doing taxes or homework or at times going to the gym, but if it's something you want to do, how do you get yourself to do it? Then the behavioral piece is the engagement with it. And now I'll think about doing a blog, putting the T back in CBT with this, um, what I outlined there. And you know what? I don't want to I don't want to underestimate the role of the therapeutic alliance there, because that usually gets short shrift in CBT because that's important, sitting across from somebody who gets it. And when you invariably slip up, as we all do, we all procrastinate at some point. And not all procrastination or avoidance is bad necessarily, but it's like, how do I get back to it? Um, but this also doesn't happen in a vacuum. It can be happen in the course of a performance improvement plan at work, maybe relationship difficulties and stress, maybe managing some other form of chronic illness that requires organization and follow through. I was working with a client who got diagnosed with Lyme disease, and they were really inconsistent with their prescribed antibiotic, which was extending the course of their illness. And there's some data on dental health and ADHD, keeping up with brushing and flossing, semi-annual visits. It's like, oh yeah, I got to do that. I got to do that. But one thing leads to another. And, again, Mr. Bad News here, but even some longitudinal studies, one of them in particular, um, the health behaviors at age 27 for the group with ADHD put through a risk algorithm said that at 27, your expected life expectancy was reduced by over a decade.
Mm.
Now, these are all behaviors that could be changed, like smoking, drinking, exercise, diabetes risk, things like that. But that means it has to be part of a treatment plan because just giving somebody a pamphlet saying do this. Like I said, if there's a Nobel Prize in medicine, medical practice, I'd go back to med school and tell everybody lose 10 pounds and stop smoking. And I'll change the world. But behavior change is difficult, especially for folks with ADHD.
Yeah. Well, I think that the challenge, I love that you did highlight self compassion in your writing, and I did as well, because I think that when we are being so critical of ourselves, and I think that's where there's this so much guilt that we begin to use guilt as a motivation, that if I tell myself I've really blown it or I'm the worst, that's somehow going to motivate me to go and do something better. And I think there's a lot of overlap, women in general who are struggling, but just ADHD, where there's this sense of I'm going to beat myself up and that's finally going to get me to go and do the thing. And so I'm wondering how you talk to people about motivation, how to kind of mobilize themselves to do the things that they have this goal. It's clear and there, but to get from here to there feels impossible.
One of it is, and it is a little bit of a cliche, but a cliche that works, values, the valuation of the task. Why is this important to you? Why do you want this? And why is this important to you? And one of the other features I forgot to mention within the outline, the CBT that I've added in and stressed more, and is the relationship interpersonal side. And it's also not cheating to say, all right, this thing that you want to do, how might it also help somebody else, a loved one, a pet? Because, a lot of times people won't go out for their own walk, but they'll take their pet for a walk. So this is why body doubling can work sometimes. And there's an example in the book where I talk about this busy professional woman who was having a hard time keeping up with stuff, but her daughter needed a financial aid form for college so she could apply for scholarships. And that's what made her, helped her take a day off. When she was really, type A. I know there's no type A. That data was actually not credible, but it's still a useful description. It's a useful category. But how that allowed her to say, I can ease up a little bit. I want to do this for my daughter, not that we're trying to, overstep boundaries or codependency or anything like that, but it was a motivator for her. So that motivation and being able to sit with that and generate it up and think about what this might look like. Um, it can also be dealing with the slip up. So I think we were talking before about how often, for relatively minor things, people use guilt and shame, where it might be, oh, I was frustrated with myself the other day. No, I felt guilty. I felt shame that I was late or whatever the case may be. And I go into this a little bit with the book, and it gets to the social interpersonal side. Um, you know, Guilt is an emotion associated with the sense we made a mistake, and we can make amends. And shame might be a higher level, where it's I'm violating community standards, the reasonable larger expectations. So, a guilt might be something like I forgot my sister's birthday, so I have to get her a happy belated birthday card. And the thing I point out to people, you know what, they have a happy belated birthday section in the card section.
Yes.
So it's probably more than one person. They're not going to do all that money. And shame is humans doing human stuff, getting charged with DUI, extramarital affair, whatever. And there can be consequences. But usually what the person's talking about, this is an example from a previous book. This woman I was working with, she was an organizer at her, an administrative assistant at her job, and that was really taxing for her. And she ended up running late she had to put off because she had to stay late at work, and Halloween was coming up. And oh, I got to get candy. I got to get candy. And then she, left work late, Halloween evening, trying to get home in time to go trick or treating with the kids. And all they had was the not so good candy. Well, let's just say the circus peanuts. For some reason, I like those, but that seems to be everybody's least favorite. And she described what we were talking about it. Oh, I always do this. Now I'm going to be a bad reflection on my family, and my kids aren't. We're not going to, And we labeled it candy shame because she's going to say we're going to be the house that only had the circus peanuts, and that's going to bring shame and dishonor on my family. She didn't say that exactly, she was tearful. And actually, a colleague of mine, a woman colleague, Laura Nouse. She's at the University of Richmond. She has an excellent book too, Living Well with Adult ADHD, just out earlier this year, I think. Really good at promoting other people's stuff. But she said that really resonated with her. She's a parent too, and she was just saying that hit home a little bit. Now she's somebody who's an expert in adult ADHD, but sitting with a lot of clients, and she's primarily a researcher, but did clinical work too. Um, how she could see how that could really hit because it seems funny. I smile at it. I bring this up, but it's failing at a role, even buying candy, where we say in the grand scheme of the universe, when your child is valedictorian of high school and they're giving their speech, and I was able to overcome the peanuts on the Halloween 2020 whatever. But in the moment, it's that overwhelm. So we were just going back talking about it, what are all the ways you fulfill your roles? So even if this happened, in the grand scheme of things, how important is it really? And what are all the important things that you do? Because this can be that selective abstraction, focusing on the negative and ignoring the positive, and yes, butting it away. Well, that's what you're supposed to do as a parent, as a partner, as an employee. Another thing that seems to be useful that I'll say, in actual violations, let's just say from jaywalking to a parking ticket to a speeding ticket to a misdemeanor to whatever's worse than that, maybe, I don't know, maybe getting a DUI or, first degree murder. Where does it fall on that continuum? And most people, it's like jaywalking, maybe at worst a speeding ticket. It could be worse at times, but that gives a perspective okay, I don't want to get a speeding ticket, but at least it's not that. So it's that sort of perspective taking, but also in the context of hopefully a supportive therapeutic relationship where we're able to take the pause and sit with it, sit with the discomfort,
Hmm.
and then reconfigure it, but also authentically give credit for here's all the things that you're already doing, and in the grand scheme of things, is that important? At least
Right.
it can, at least it can be peace, yeah.
Yeah, the reframe there is helpful. I'm wondering how you describe, and I think what I think is can happen so often is a sense of perfectionism that is a
Yeah.
common cognitive distortion in ADHD and in many other areas. I was just on a radio show talking about it in relationship to guilt, but how that actually can co-occur and create procrastination. That those
Yes.
two seem to be, I think, so commonly linked. Can you describe how you talk about that or what you hear from people in
Right,
those
right.
areas?
Work to sit across from a lot of people, and a lot I learned from my clients. Like I joke to say, when we started the ADHD program back in '99, the adult ADHD, I'm dispositionally lazy. There wasn't that much literature to get through, so it's tailor-made. No, but what it is, I think perfectionism and ADHD, and there could be different perfectionism, but Now, and we had a study where it was far and away the number one for ADHD, and it showed up in a follow-up study we just did. I'm presenting a paper on it in a few weeks, where it was there along with emotional reasoning and comparative thinking, externalization of self-worth. So we're proposing, like, is there a cognitive triad for ADHD? But perfectionism was there too. And I said, working with a lot of clients, it seemed to be front-end perfectionism. Everything has to be just right for me to get started. I have to be energized. I have to be focused. I mean, there's some realistic, working somewhere without too much distraction. There's a minimal acceptable, but usually it was going beyond that. And generally, what I would say, I'm justified in putting this off till later when I'm assuming then I'll be in the mood or perfect or whatever. And how often, if we wait, we wouldn't have gotten out of bed today if we were waiting to feel perfect to start our day because that's such a rare thing and maybe unattainable. But I talk about the reframe of enoughness in many ways. It's like, am I, enough as a person, but also the enoughness of, okay, do I have enough focus, enough time, whatever. So that's where that front end perfectionism, I see it as, leading to, a lot of procrastination. And I think it's also tied in with, well, if I can be at my best, then maybe I can get through this quicker and it won't hurt as much because I can get through this as quick as possible. Because sometimes clients will say, I was the first one done with the test, even though I know I had a lot of errors because I just had to get out of there. So that's part of that, the emotional dysregulation of dealing with the discomfort. And it does draw a little bit on or a lot from exposure therapy for anxiety, even though it's a little different. Even though it's maybe not an anxiety disorder, but it's what I call and took it from a client, the ugh feeling. I know I can do it. I know I'll eventually do it, but not now. And so that now, not now problem, put it off till later. And we don't always have to do everything right at the time we're thinking about it, but this is why it's good to have a planner, or at least if we do put it off now, we have a plan for when we're going to do it. But that's part of the personalization of this for ADHD.
And I think a number of different strategies you recommend, I was going to have you kind of share what they mean. One is kind of having a keystone habit, there's habit stacking, and then certainly planners and to do lists, which I know featured prominently in a prior book with Dr. Rostein. So,
Right, right.
what are some of these strategies, and how could people listening start implementing them today?
Yeah. Well, the keystone habit, that comes from the book The Power of Habit by Charles Duhigg, Duhigg, a great book, a bestseller from years ago. What it was is rather than changing too much, have one thing that you focus on. Maybe it's getting out of bed at the alarm, going for a walk after work, going to the gym after work. And if you do that around that, you get some other changes for free. So if you get to the gym, maybe you're more likely to eat healthy. If you get up earlier, you're more likely to get started on things, get more done, and then maybe being able to have more time to rest and relax in the evening or getting to bed at the right time, even though all the advice on sleep is the wake up time is the more important time to keep to that as best you can. Habit stacking is adding to something you're already doing. The easy one is you're already brushing your teeth. Let's try to move the floss in there and do it. It could be, okay, if I'm taking the dishes over to the sink, let me just put them in the dishwasher now rather than waiting till later. I'm putting my clothes away from today. Let me get out my clothes for tomorrow. So I don't have to think about it at 5 a.m. in the morning or look in the dark saying, is this blue or black? I can't tell. Um, and then the planner, um, yes, that's like the cliche within ADHD, and it's almost like, okay, I think maybe in this book I wrote, I hear you groaning. Yes, it's the planner, um, but it's a time machine. It is externalization of time because time flows on, and really all a planner is when you buy, you could print one out every day, an activity chart. It is just empty rows and columns, how we divide up time into whatever increments we use. Other analogies are it's like getting $24 a day. How do you spend it? And we spend some on sleep, some on commuting, some on just coming and going from around the house, meals, hopefully, exercise. Where does it go? Including, and I'm a big proponent of downtime, just puttering around, just doing what you feel like, whatever. So usually some form of externalization of time, including some sort of portable timepiece or clock, visible, usually some sort of analog, because digital, we can go, okay, 3:58. Oh, it's not 4 yet. I got time. As opposed to like seeing the hour hand almost there, or I've always said, and there's probably digital versions of this, like the best representation of time is an hourglass. Seeing time drain, seeing the sand drain from the top chamber to the bottom chamber. And it is personalized. Like I said, downtime, leave breaks. Because even going through your day, like you and I, like if we're seeing clients, or I can look over here and say, oh, I got a break after this, or whatever the case may be. So knowing where our rest is, because we're also pacing ourselves. Because ADHD increasingly is associated with a lot of fatigue. You mentioned it, the cognitive load of having to think through a lot of things. And with scheduling, winging it, I'll do what I feel like doing is high cognitive load, because there's going to be a lot of things you have the time to do, but you won't do. And so, I actually have it over here. William James's quote, "Nothing is so fatiguing as the eternal hanging on of an uncompleted task." That some colleagues, Michael Manos, and I'm forgetting on his co-author's name, Elizabeth Short, I think, middle-aged working memory, but that was pretty quick. They would say uncompleted tasks are the core issue with ADHD. And these could be, existential endeavors. These could be pragmatic tasks, but all this going back to your relationship with time, but also a planner's also a diary of your accomplishments. If you look back, I haven't gotten anything done this week, to say, okay, maybe not as much as I could have, but I did do this, I did do that. So that sort of data-based reframe is useful. And also it's something about writing out. And I'm all for digital planners too, but there's something about handwriting out. Not that we rely on memory. Okay, I wrote it down, I'll remember it, but there's something about, I think I remember writing this down. And there's more and more data about writing is preferred, especially with note taking and things like that, to digital, even though I'm not going to handwrite my next book, and I didn't handwrite this one. So, there are some points for it, but like some of these things like note taking and keeping a planner, if you can do it, but digital is fine. Whatever works, whatever works.
I'm wondering about, one of the reframes you describe is normalization, and just
Yes.
reminding individuals that many people struggle with different tasks, that it's not you are the worst or the only one that struggles, and that we all kind of have tools. I'm thinking as you're talking about all the ways I try and protect my own attention. It's I've turned off every notification on my phone I can think of, and I
Hmm.
wear an analog watch, and I try and keep my office space really clean, and like
Hmm.
just trying to find things, because I know how easily distracted I can become. And so
Yes.
I think there's a big overlap now between just your environment and tech, because tech is always in there with us. So I'm wondering what
Yep.
you would recommend to listeners, how to set up their environment, and also it's a big topic, but just their
Yes.
relationship with tech.
Yes, I now have a home decoration business, so you can hire me at my website. No, kidding aside, no, it's a great question, because part of self-regulation is also modifying our environment to make it easy. So if you can't resist cookies, don't bring cookies into the house. That is self-regulation, but it's making it easier. Um, yeah, know your sensitivities. If, having a window that lets sunlight in helps you, but if that's also going to be, you're going to be watching everybody walk their dogs, maybe put your desk elsewhere, or have drapes that you can close. Some of these things, know thyself, and maybe not have your workstation next to your entertainment station. Now, I get it. People might have, studio apartments or whatever, but the best you can to set it up for, success. Um, even at a workplace. Now, I will say this, and there's also, I think, some evidence for it. Open office spaces are a colossal failure because they're distracting for everybody.
Mm-hmm.
And also, there's a wonderful book. It's called The Extended Mind. I'm blanking on, I can't, I see the spine, but you'll find it. It's an excellent book. Annie Murphy Paul. Boy, okay. That's the author. Um, Talks about this, how also, even though interacting with other people helps generate ideas and creativity, we need to be able to go away to our cave, our office, whatever, to just congeal them. That's that reconstitution, put them back together in different ways or reflect on them. So even if you're in an open office space, maybe asking for the accommodation, can I go into the conference room or a closed door office? Maybe go into a coffee shop or something, as long as that's not distracting and may not be able to leave the office. But also, that could be something with working remotely. If somebody goes, okay, I'm done with work at home, but I'm around all my creature comforts, and it may be going to the place with an intention to work. It could be a public library, it could be a college student going to the campus library. So there's usually some workarounds, and we can beat ourselves up saying, I'm a fully functioning adult. I should not have to do this, but many fully functioning adults do exactly this. And, I'll do a judicious self-disclosure and just talk about, I should be able to sit here. Or when I was at Penn, and you'll be familiar with this, we'd have our university computer and our health system computer. So I had two full IT available. I should be able to work on my manuscript here. No, I'd swing my chair around, have a little chair I kept between the chairs. I'd see clients and I'd bring my laptop because if I'm on those computers, I'll be doing pen stuff, one way or another. Not that that was wrong. But it would just be not what, I was also doing something part of my job there too. So it would be, I should be able to get, embarrassment of riches, but I needed to do that to make sure I got. And you know what? And what happens is sometimes even going to the work or study station, even in our apartment, with the intention of doing work. And I use this example. It could be we're in a studio apartment, we have a kitchen table with two chairs. Sit in the chair. The work one is the chair you don't eat at. So it's a little different vista. And just going there with the intention of working is a behavioral crime. Just like getting to the gym. Once I'm at the gym, people say, all right, once I'm there, I'm not going to work out, even though I've heard stories, you get into a conversation or something, but you've just exponentially increased the likelihood of follow through. So all these little manipulations that we say, I should be able to do it this way, people get things done. I mean, I'm sure there's some prodigies who are able to do that, but most everybody else, we're manipulating our environment to, and the tools we come up with, like the wonderful digital tools, which are trade-offs because they can help with productivity, but also, with one click, they're getting in the way. So it's also portion controlling some of our recreational use of our gadgets.
And I don't know whether or not you are, a TikTok influencer. I would guess probably not.
I
Um,
dispositionally have not because there's data that 80, well, I'll be precise, 79% of the information on TikTok is unreliable. But a lot of it is from personal testimonies, which are the most persuasive. And there was actually a study that they presented like more reliable information, and it was rated high, but people would still gravitate. So it'd be almost like they were given apples and say, "Oh, this is pretty good," but then they're going back to the candy because it's more available and easily accessible. So that's just my dispositionally, or I guess I'm making a point, which I'm sure they're suffering as a result of this, but
yeah.
uh, yeah. But I'm on other social media, so it's not like all or nothing.
Is there any like big myth that you think is portrayed on social media about ADHD or elsewhere that you would love to sort of debunk today?
You know what? It's not wrong, but they're non-specific symptoms, so they really don't differentiate. Because one of them, reading about even in a professional journal, is having a hard time getting started on a topic that you don't find interesting. That doesn't discriminate ADHD or not. If you give me a book written in French, I'll stare at it, and it looks like a lovely language. It sounds like a lovely language, but I can't read it. So I'll have a really hard time just even flipping through 100 pages of that. So, but that kidding aside, other things like I think there was something like unfolded laundry, which people will describe, but there's at least this study hasn't been done where we say that's a reliable symptom of it. So it's usually these things that are from personal experiences that may not be wrong for that person, but even though that's not going to be the thing that we go, oh, this is what sealed the deal. And ADHD is a tough one. I still, I meet with somebody, I'm going back through the data a few times, and I try the old school null hypothesis. If this isn't ADHD, how would I make the case? But what I would tell the trainees, like, there are different patches associated with ADHD, and some things that are not. But we're just seeing if there are enough patches that go together and make a quilt that aren't better explained by something else, or there's not these huge gaps where there have to be some quilts. And I've never made a quilt in my life, but it's a good analogy from what I hear. But it's a tough one, and very often it makes sense why the person was seeking an evaluation because there are quote unquote attention problems, maybe procrastination problems, all these other things, but they're coming from something else, maybe some situational factors. One example I used in a previous book, somebody went from a small neighborhood insurance agency to a large corporate one. And so all of a sudden this one, and they had a small child and things like that. So the local one was a lot more forgiving, and they just had a hard time adjusting to the, oh, you haven't met your numbers. We need to bring that up. Whereas before there's a little more, leeway, but that ended up being more of an anxiety life circumstance issue. And once they were able to get stable on that and doing CBT for anxiety, they actually were able to get on top of things.
Well, I'd love to keep asking questions, but I know we're running short on time. I think the last one I wanted to ask, though, is to end on a high note.
Yeah.
And I think what you described beautifully in the
Excuse
book
me.
was the positive aspects of people with ADHD, some of the different gifts that they have or differences in how they might be thinking or applying their energy or attention. I think there were quite a lot of them, and it was just nice to
Yeah.
see kind of bookending with some of those positives. I'm wondering if you could just highlight some of your favorites.
Some of my favorites, I forget they're in the book, but somebody who was in a healthcare research field. It's almost like the old school who worked his way up from the mailroom. He started off as like a lab assistant and things like that, and actually went back to school and all that. And he was reaching a certain point where, he knew his stuff pretty well, but he was running into like some resistance or not being taken seriously, or maybe holding back a little bit. Because, he would still like there's some disorganization there and whatnot, um, but was able to speak up more and also was more organized. And actually started presenting some innovative stuff that not a lot from his granular experience of being literally hands-on with stuff. And also being able to, if somebody raised a counterpoint, he could speak back to it and say, no, here's what the data say, and sort of, engage in it. And now that was also these times where, sometimes there was pushback because he didn't have all the letters behind his name that he needed, but he had the know-how, and that he was able to persist on that enough that people in the know were hearing what he was saying and not worried about. And so he had more allies. And so that was really rewarding, and he's thriving. I mean, there are still some things, working at a large institution, and that sometimes the institution can be stressful. But there's also some other one, and sometimes it's more humble, like I got through my to-do list today, or I was able to get to the gym all the days, or I was actually to wrap up with stuff. And I could have done one more thing, but I decided to stop and I said, I can move that to tomorrow so that I can go to my son's Little League game and stuff like that. So, sometimes it's these day-to-day things that we might take for granted, but somebody goes, no, I was never able to do that because I was still at the office trying to catch up. And it can also be things, people going back to finish a degree or saying, I'm going to go for this. And I never would have thought, this was never on my radar screen before, but I always thought, I wonder if I'd be good at that, or I'd like to take a class in that. Now I can trust it's still a class, but I can do well enough. I trust that I can do well enough to pass, even if I don't get an A, but maybe they do get better than they thought they would. So it's sort of like the expectations, their actual follow through exceeding their expectations. So I just want to pass. And then once they're engaged, I'll do it. Once they got started, they found that, breaking it down step by step using some of the skills is like I was actually to get things done on time and not need extra time or take an incomplete or something like that. So in many different ways, these are the things. One of my clients, in the Once I Get Started book, there's a coping glossary in the back where it's a quick summation, a quick go-to reference for people to say, oh, what was that distant self-talk or whatever. Um, and I gave her, we're working on some of this stuff, and I gave her an early, like from the copy edits, to say, here's that section if you find it useful. And she said, you know what, I was going through it, so I actually printed it out, cut them into individual labels, and laminated them. And she has them on this little ring that she carries around with them. So that was pretty rewarding because she goes, I want to have this with me at the point of performance, but the, like I said, there's no trade secrets. This stuff works. We all know they work, but it's they're doing it. And with ADHD, it can be more difficult, but that's the personalization of it. But whatever works.
Yeah. Yeah, I think a lot about sort of the evolution of our different traits. I think it's really fascinating. And I think I like to highlight for people that with ADHD, there's something that's been adaptive about that for our species, and that there are aspects of their creativity, their ability to kind of pull in different ideas and overlap, sort of responding and thriving in very high stimulating environments at times, being really active and on the move. I'm thinking like an ER physician, which was definitely
Mhm.
not my nervous system's favorite place to be. So
Right,
I
right.
think also highlighting some of the gifts that those differences in their learning and differences in their approach can provide and provide society. So there are
Right.
challenges, but I think also highlighting those. So I like that those were in your book and people can
Yeah.
read those. So,
Thank you.
as far as finding out more about your work, I know that you see individuals across many states in the country and help them with
Yes, yes.
CBT for ADHD. What's the best way to find you and how can they connect?
The easiest place is, and there's a contact form on there, my website, www.cbt number four ADHD.com. Sometimes people hear CBD and they get really excited, but no, CBT, like cognitive behavioral therapy, number four ADHD.com. That's me. So
Got it. Got it. Well, I will put a note in the podcast notes. And then
great.
also, once again, congratulations on this latest of your
Well,
impressive boudoir of
and well, right
ADHD.
back to you for your first, but it's a much needed addition. So I'm sure it's going to help a lot of people, a lot of women.
Well, thank you. So, any listeners out there know that we both are providers, healthcare providers, but not your providers. So, make sure that you're connecting with your individual providers if you have any questions or concerns. And this is just for informational purposes. So, thank you so much and have a good day.